Considering how bloody it was, some might say that the Civil War was anything but civil, especially in regards to the guerrilla fighters who used the war not to pursue freedom and liberty, but as an excuse to start killing their neighbors and other people who had wronged them at some point, or those men who took advantage of the fighting to rob people, destroy property, and attack women. Honest and decent, as many of the soldiers on the front lines undoubtedly were, there were soldiers who were unscrupulous villains, practically inhuman monsters. But within all of the strange and gory stories that came out of the war between the states, there was something else that men on both the Confederate and Union side encountered in the forested regions where many of their battles took place. Reading through the letters and memoirs of Civil War soldiers, mentions were infrequently made about inhuman creatures wandering the battlefields. And no, these men weren't referring to guerrilla fighters, but guerrilla is a word that isn't that far off the mark. They reported massive humanoid creatures that wore no uniforms aside from a surplus amount of body hair. Living a reclusive life deep in the remote forests and caves of the Appalachian region, the soldiers who met these creatures often referred to them as wild men, man-beasts, or simply monsters. Creatures with very large feet. These are stories of cryptid encounters from the American Civil War. The mist which hangs before you
offers you a choice
to pass through
or to escape.
Beyond it are
Stories
which defy
the explanation
and fly in the face.
of what we know to be real,
It is a void of both
reality
and impossibility.
of both fact
and superstition.
You alone are left to discern
what to believe as you pass through what we call the fog of war.
How do you reckon the Rebs are taking this cold? Them Southern boys probably wish they was back home, don't you think?
Cold or not, it don't seem to stop them from woofing us. Robertson was saying we might be moving out soon. Berryville or some other damn place. You hear anything about that?
Nah, but that's probably what this here train of supplies is all for. I tell you, it'd be a sight better if we could ride on one of these.
Oh, something's happening.
Stay put. Could be Rebs trying to draw us away from the supply train.
Am I hearing that right? What the hell's a man-beast?
By early 1863, the Civil War wasn't going well for the Union North. The war was about to enter its second year, and any hope the federal government had for a quick victory over the South was gone. Things had started out well for the Union at the beginning of 1862. They won a number of victories in the West and launched the Peninsula Campaign that aimed to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. But the campaign resulted in a total failure, and the body count on both sides was staggering. The battles of Antietam and Fredericksburg in the fall and winter of 1862 resulted in even higher casualties, the most ever before seen on American soil, and it was only going to get worse. In the middle of all this fighting was the small Virginia town of Harper's Ferry. Sitting right on the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, Harper's Ferry was a vital railway junction and home to the U.S. Federal Armory. By the time the war was over, the town had seen dozens of battles and had been recaptured by the opposing sides at least 8 times. At the time our story takes place, in February 1863, Harper's Ferry was in the hands of the Union Army. more specifically, the 67th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment. One of the unit's soldiers was a young private by the name of James Moore. While occupying the town one chilly winter night, Moore and a fellow soldier named Ramsey found themselves up late on the watch shift. The pair had been ordered to stand guard on a supply train that would soon be departing for the front lines. All in all, it was stacking up to be an uneventful night. The only noise was a frigid winter breeze that came off the river and howled over the high cliffs surrounding the town. The two soldiers patrolled up and down the quiet railway, trying their best to keep warm. But things soon took a strange turn. Private Moore would later recount the events of that night in a letter to his wife, dated February 26, 1863.
Ramsey and myself were charged to guard company accoutrements along the railway. Very cold, still night. The boys started raising a ruckus from the garrison. Some were yelling aloud that a man-beast was on foot. There was rifle fire towards the river. We continued our duty as the yelling and shots continued. The corporal queried the witnesses from the company. I was told that the devil raided the food stores after climbing the wall. It was covered in thick layers of dark hair, maybe 8 foot from head to toe.
This letter, written by a private James Moore, reportedly first appeared in the late 1990s when it was sold at auction as part of a larger collection of old personal writings and correspondence. The few lines regarding the man-beast seen by his fellow soldiers were evidently only fragments of a much longer written account. In an article he posted on the emerging Civil War website, journalist Aaron Stoyak explained what happened. The letter was sold in 1999 to a now unknown buyer, but the auction company had made transcripts of some of the old letters to put into their pamphlets. One of the auction appraisers, intrigued by the strange story, had kept one of these pamphlets and later contacted the author of a cryptid website to share the soldier's encounter. Unfortunately, the full account was lost when the appraiser's house caught fire in 2005, and the auction pamphlet was destroyed. While researching Moore's account, I couldn't help but to notice that Harper's Ferry is located directly on the Appalachian Trail, which is no stranger to unexplained paranormal phenomena. This includes multiple sightings of the creature called Sasquatch and the Appalachian Trail's connections to the infamous Missing 411. So it reasons that an encounter of this kind could have happened there, if it was going to happen anywhere. When it comes to Sasquatch or Bigfoot, there are many native legends and other oral stories passed down by generations of families that predate the 1860s. But in spite of his original letter being unaccounted for, James Moore's account is considered by some to be one of the earliest documented Bigfoot encounters in the United States. And as it turns out, Private Moore wasn't the only Civil War soldier to write about man-beasts.
I thought it's page 6. Come in.
Apologies, sir. Is it a bad time?
As good a time as any. What is it?
A wire came through this morning from a Mr. George Anderson of Birmingham, Alabama. Claims he was a captain who fought under Bragg during the war.
A rebel, huh? Well, what does he want?
Honestly, sir, it's best if you read it yourself.
Did you ever hear the story of the wild man of Cumberland Mountain? You have any idea what he's on about?
Not a clue, sir.
Well, get in touch and ask me more details. Who knows? Could make for some interesting page filler.
This next story first appeared in the August 2nd, 1890 edition of the Pittsburgh Dispatch newspaper. It was submitted by a former Confederate officer named George Anderson, who served as a captain under General Braxton Bragg. Anderson's story picks up in September of 1863. Just prior to the Battle of Chickamauga, Confederate forces would dig in near the small towns of Bridgeport and Stevenson, just over the Alabama state line. While Bragg readied his forces for the upcoming battle, Captain Anderson's outfit was assigned to the rear guard and found themselves posted up in the Cumberland Mountains, overlooking the two towns. The Union troops that had chased them out of Tennessee weren't far behind, but something far worse than the Yankees was waiting for them on that mountain.
I had only 60 men in my company at that time. One half of them were on duty at night, the other half during the day. The pickets were placed almost 50 yards apart as a number of scouts were detailed to watch the enemy in front of us. In placing my men on the picket line, I visited each post. Near the center of the line, a man was stationed at the mouth of a narrow, dark-looking ravine which led up somewhere into the mountains. The post was under a large oak tree, and at night the spot was so dark a man could not be seen 10 feet away. The first night we were on duty, Andrew Mason, one of the best and bravest men in my company, was at the post under the big tree. When the pickets were relieved the next morning, Mason was missing. His gun was found on the ground at the post, and there were signs of a desperate struggle, but Mason could not be found. His gun had not been discharged, and I thought a small scouting party of the enemy had crept upon him unawares and taken him prisoner. I ordered the scouts in front to keep a close watch for foraging or scouting parties of the enemy, and when the pickets were changed at sundown, I cautioned the man who took the post under the big oak to keep a careful lookout and not get captured. That night, some of the scouts came in and reported that there was not a blue coat within 10 miles of us. The second morning, the picket under the oak was gone. His gun was there, and again there was evidence of a struggle, but outside of a circle of 20 feet, we could discover no footprints.
With 2 soldiers now having vanished, some of the men were starting to feel a little bit unnerved. But the third soldier assigned to the post wasn't so easily frightened. His name was Brown, a man Anderson described as being a strapping young man and as brave as a lion. When his captain advised him to be extra alert on that night's watch, Brown was reported to have laughed off Anderson's warning. He puffed his chest and claimed that it would take an entire company to capture him alive. That night, Brown would disappear. Now the third man to go missing. Initially, Anderson thought that these men were deserting their posts. But when a fourth man disappeared, this time one of Anderson's most loyal sergeants, he knew that something must be happening to them. And he wasn't the only one concerned. Some of his soldiers were bordering on hysterics, claiming that evil spirits were behind the strange disappearances. Anderson had to work quickly to get the situation under control.
When night came, I placed a man there as usual, telling him I would have an extra guard around the place. Then taking 10 picked men whose courage I could rely on, I stationed them at short intervals so as to completely surround the big oak tree where 5 of my men had been so mysteriously captured. My orders were for every man to remain perfectly quiet until he heard a struggle under the tree. Then all rushed to the relief of the man on the post. There was to be no shot fired if it could be avoided. I wanted to capture the mysterious enemy alive. I took a position inside my line of guards and about 50 feet from the tree. I listened intently and soon heard plainly the rustling of the branches as though some wild animal was moving about in the tree.
What in blue blazes is that?
Sounds like it's up in the trees.
Damn it, get in there!
It was probably 5 minutes after I first heard the rustling among the branches of the tree when some object fell to the ground with a thud. Instantly, there was a cry of pain or terror from the sentinel under the tree, and I shouted to my men to rush forward. As we closed in, we could only see 2 forms struggling as if for life. I ordered my men to seize both, and as quickly as possible I made light. My picket was in the grasp of a giant. A man clothed in rags with long matted hair and beard had caught the soldier around the body and pinned his arms to the side. The strength of this strange being was that of a giant, and it was several minutes before my 10 men could completely overpower him. I built a fire and we dragged him to the light where he was securely bound. He lay there and glared at us like a wild beast, but uttered no sound. We had solved the mystery of the capture of our men, but now the question was how we would learn their fate. I asked him again and again what he had done with the men he caught, but received no answer. Then I tried to make him understand by signs what I wanted to know, but he only laughed a wild, unhuman-like laugh. We remained by the fire under the big oak with our prisoners securely bound until daylight. Then I promised him his liberty if he would tell what he had done with the men he had captured or guide us to his den. To both propositions he made no reply. I saw the man was a maniac and decided to try a strategy to gain the information I wanted. Placing my men around him with fixed bayonets, I motioned him to go on, but he would not move. The wild man was over 6 feet high and would weigh probably 250 pounds. His hair and beard were long and unkempt, and his clothes were a mass of rags and tatters. I noticed an ugly-looking scar on the top of his head. Threats, persuasion, and force all failing to induce him to talk or lead us to his hiding place, I decided to try another plan. Telling my men to let the man go, I ordered them to shoulder arms and we started back towards the camp. The scheme was successful. The moment the wild man realized he was at liberty, he dashed off up the narrow ravine. I called on my men to follow me. It was all we could do to keep him in sight, so great was his speed. He evidently did not suspect that we would follow him, for he never once looked back. Up the narrow ravine he led us on a lively chase for a mile or more. We had been climbing all the way and were near the summit of the Cumberland mountains when the wild man turned aside from the ravine and started into a large cave. Then he looked back for the first time and saw us in pursuit. He stood still a moment, then turned and again set out towards the summit of the mountain. Ordering 2 of my men to remain and watch the cave, I pushed on with the others in pursuit of the wild man. He ran probably 300 yards to the edge of a high precipice. There he turned and, picking up several large stones, hurled them at us with great force. We dodged the stones and pressed on. Seeing escape cut off, the man turned and, uttering a wild, unearthly cry, leaped over the precipice. I shut my eyes as I saw him leap into space. We cautiously crawled up to the edge of the cliff, and looking down, we could see the mangled body of the wild man lying on the rocks more than 100 feet below. We turned and retraced our steps to the cave. There we found our missing pickets. The cave was the dwelling place of the wild man, and inside, the 5 men of my company who had fallen into his hands were tied to stakes driven in the ground. They had not been harmed by their wild captor, but had been without food and water since their capture. Not one word had the wild man spoken to any of them, but from his manner and gestures they were of the opinion that he was saving them for some fiendish torture which his crazed brain would suggest. He had captured the first man by creeping upon him in the darkness. After that, his plan was to return to the spot during the night and, climbing the big oaks, conceal himself among the branches, where he would remain until the next night and then drop on his victim from the tree. A few days later, I learned the story of the wild man of the mountains from a resident of that locality. His name was Bill Patton, and before the war he had lived in a small cabin upon the mountain and earned a scant livelihood by hunting and fishing. He was a Union man in sentiment and refused to join the Confederate Army. One day he was captured by a squad of home guards while he was selling some game in Bridgeport, and they started with him to the nearest conscripting office. On the way, he escaped from his captors after a desperate struggle, in which he received a terrible cut on the head with a saber. He recovered from the wound, but it left him a maniac. He took to the mountain again and lived in caves, subsisting on the game he could kill. In his madness, he had probably planned a terrible revenge for the wound which destroyed his reason.
This wild man of Cumberland Mountain obviously wasn't a Bigfoot encounter, so George Anderson's story could provide a plausible explanation for what soldiers were seeing out in the wilderness. The Appalachian region was possibly full of mountain hermits who wanted to avoid the war and became a bit feral, living off the land away from human civilization. The concept of wild men or mountain men wasn't unheard of in 19th century America. As the country became increasingly more industrialized, more and more men chose to abandon the modern world and all the problems that came with it, adopting a much more rugged lifestyle. In one recorded instance in 1871, a wild man was captured by a posse of citizens from Morgantown, West Virginia. He was described as half man and half beast, covered in rags with long bushy hair, giving him the appearance of a gorilla more than a human being. This wild man was apparently an Irish immigrant named Thomas Foley, who had lived in Connecticut for years before disappearing into the West Virginia wilderness. While racial divisions in the 1860s and 70s are well known, what is probably less known is the severe discrimination of the Irish and other European immigrants in America around this time. Many Irish were viewed with disdain, enduring frequent mockery and outright persecution, including lynchings and other murders. They were often depicted as drunken, slovenly, and ape-like. The phrase, "no Irish need apply," was commonly seen in job advertisements and shop windows. After fighting in the Civil War and aiding the Union victory, hatred for the Irish began to soften. But it's possible that this discrimination is also what drove Foley away from people. The people of West Virginia seemed more hospitable, though, as the residents of Morgantown took pity on Foley and attempted to reintroduce him back to society. They even bought him a whole new set of clothes as a welcoming gift. But, as they say, you can take a man out of the woods, but you can't take the woods out of a man. The last time anyone saw Thomas Foley, he had stripped off his new clothes and was running out of Morgantown on foot towards the woods, stark naked. The wild man phenomenon would be an easy explanation for these and other reports of Bigfoot creatures, but it doesn't seem to account for what the following soldier witnessed after being wounded on the battlefield.
Oh God. Oh God. Oh, my legs. I can't move. Oh, help. Somebody. Oh, please. I can't move. Oh, water. Oh, please. Over here, please. Please help me. Who's that?
This final story was first submitted to the Dixie Cryptid podcast and aired in 2018 in an episode titled A Civil War Encounter. The host, Cameron Buckner, stated that the account was another one found in a letter written by a Civil War veteran around 30 years after the war in 1895. The letter, now damaged by a century of aging, was carefully shown to Cameron by a local historian and writer. The historian told Cameron that he would prefer to keep the soldier's name off the record, so we'll just refer to him as Abraham, or Abe for short. Abe's story begins on the day he rode to Memphis, Tennessee to enlist in the Confederate Army. Falling in with a cavalry unit led by Nathan Bedford Forrest, the man credited with starting the Ku Klux Klan group, Abe would eventually find himself fighting in the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads on June 10, 1864. While taking cover behind a tree, a canister round exploded against its trunk, sending splinters and shrapnel into Will's right arm and legs. The blast hurled him to the ground, knocking him unconscious. When Abe came to hours later, the battle was over and the sun had set. The battlefield was now eerily quiet, and Abe found himself all alone in the desolate landscape of shattered trees and dead bodies. By this point, Abe had lost a lot of blood and was fighting the overwhelming fatigue taking hold of him. But just when he thought he was done for, help arrived, although it clearly wasn't the kind he was expecting.
I laid back and wondered if anyone would find me. I would soon realize that I was on my own. I felt tired again, and I was fighting the sleep that was about to again overtake me, when I heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps. I rolled my head over to see who would be my rescuer, and I saw 2 tree-trunk-thick legs standing next to me. I was so weak that it did not matter to me. Maybe I was hallucinating. Then the figure bent down as if to look at me. I heard a low, guttural noise. A purr, if you will. It was not human. I fought sleep off with all my might. It was overtaking me again. Then there were 2 of the furry figures standing at my feet. They were communicating in some language that I did not understand. The largest of the 2 leaned over again and wrapped its huge hand around my right leg and pulled. I resounded with a scream. The pain was too much to bear. The second beast took my other leg, and they began to drag me away from the tree and through the leaves and the green undergrowth. The pain was getting worse, and I began to scream at them, but they just kept walking. Then they let go. One dropped out of view in front of me, and I lifted my head to see what was next. Another hand wrapped around my shin, and I was being dragged over the bank into a deep creek. I felt myself being lifted into the air, and then swung over the shoulder of the beast. Then I lost consciousness. When I awoke, I was in darkness. It was cold. I did not remember it being cold. We had been beaten by heat all day and night, but now I was cool. I blinked my eyes and waited for them to adjust to the darkness. I noticed a small flicker of light in the distance. The light grew brighter, and I could see a fire had been made. I had been rescued, and I was in the hands of my countrymen. A sigh of relief exited my chest. I began to feel my legs again, and the trousers that had been wet were now dry. My bleeding had stopped, and I could move my arms, but not my legs. Then a figure began to move towards me with a torch in their hand. My horror returned when I saw that it was one of the creatures that had dragged me from the battlefield. I could not fight. I had no weapon, and I was at the mercy of a group of monsters.
Despite their terrifying appearance, They were clearly gentle. Abe realized that these monsters meant him no harm. In fact, it seemed as if they actually wanted to help him. Sheltering with the creatures in their underground den, Abe wrote in detail about how he was gradually nursed back to health over the course of a few weeks. The creatures used chewed-up vegetation to stop the infection in his wounds and provided him with fresh water and meat. Abe also recalled an instance in which one of the creatures used powdered lime in order to cover up the scent of his urine. Whatever these creatures were, not only were they compassionate, they were clearly intelligent.
Often I would see the young ones in the firelight dancing and playing, but the adults would never allow them close to me, even though they appeared to be very curious. Finally, one of the young came to me while the adults conversed in a strange language. When he approached me, he was smiling. I did not know these things could smile. I would never see that expression again, but it seemed to lift my spirits. He set a piece of wood beside my hip, reached over, and he touched my hair. He wanted to feel my hair, and then he scampered back to his place in the room. That was my only experience with a youngster.
Slowly but surely, Abe was able to regain the use of his legs, and when he was finally able to stand and walk, he decided that it was time for them to part ways. Emerging from the well-concealed cave and into the light of day for the first time in weeks, Abe said farewell to his unlikely saviors.
I turned to look at the woods behind me and saw 4 more of these creatures, all males except one, the big female who had dragged me from the battlefield. She walked to me in the huge strides they make and put her massive hand on top of my head. Then, with her other hand, she handed me my hat, which I had not seen since the Yanks sent cannon fire into our ranks. She began to turn around, and I stopped her. I held onto her hand for a minute and looked into her black eyes, and I said, "Thank you." She did not respond, but I have a sense that she knows I was showing gratitude. Then the beasts parted and gave me a lane to walk into the woods. One pointed straight ahead, so I started walking. I looked back after a few steps, and they were gone, except one of the beasts' heads I saw go down below the edge of the bank. As I walked away, I heard a loud howl from the direction I had come. I looked back again, and the whole clan was moving away from the shelter and into the woods. I am an old man now. Last year, I rode back to the battlefield and into the woods where I made my last stand. I saw war equipment still laying in the leaves, in mud rusting, all these years later. It brought back unpleasant memories. Then I rode further into the woods to the monster's den. It was gone, and the bank I had been lifted from was now washed out. I stood there for an hour, hoping to see the beast again, but there was only silence. As I mounted my horse to leave, I looked back one last time at the woods where the monsters had lived, and I wondered what had happened to them. As I rode away, I was filled with gratitude in the way they had cared for me. And then I heard a long and very loud howl come from across the creek. I never looked back.
Hey guys, thanks for sticking around for the after action here in the credits. Bigfoot is a topic that will forever be plagued by falsified accounts, which I think is a shame. But I do think that at this point, there is more than enough reason to make any of us at least accept the possibility of their existence. Even Jane Goodall, that I've quoted several times throughout these kinds of episodes, who was an expert on primates, may she rest in peace, she passed away recently. She said that, in her opinion, it had to be true, especially considering all of the consistent stories about these things that seem to exist across various cultural divides and on every continent except Antarctica. The Wild Man story just reminded me of Mr. Ballen's Do You Know How to Get to Bell's Canyon story. It really begs the question, which is more terrifying, running into a Bigfoot in the dark or running into some kind of deranged feral human that is living in the wild? These stories also reminded me of one of my favorite books that I read as a kid and that I have reread even recently, Hatchet by Gary Paulsen. That book, and then there's another one, My Side of the Mountain. To this day, with all the stresses of life, I still daydream about what it would be like to live in the quiet solitude of the middle of the Canadian wilderness, building shelters, foraging for food, eating gut cherries. If you've read the books, you know what I mean. If you've read My Side of the Mountain, having a peregrine falcon as a friend. Spoiler alert, like with the Irishman Foley's story from this episode, The Crazy Irishman, in the book Hatchet, the boy Brian, who got stranded in the wilderness for months, does end up being rescued, at least at the end of the first book. And they bring him back to his mom in California, and he goes to school and ends up beating the crap out of a bully. And he realizes that he doesn't want to be in school, he doesn't want to be back with his mom, all he wants is to be back in the woods, away from people. So then there's the follow-on book that Paulsen wrote called Brian's Return, where he ends up just going back to Canada to just live in the wild. Paulsen also wrote another book, which is a continuation from the first one, Hatchet. It's called Brian's Winter. It's a book where Brian was never rescued, and he had to survive the following winter, hunting moose, fighting off wolves and bears from his meat supply, which he kept frozen under the snow. It just a fantastic story for a young boy to read, really. I guess I kind of now wish that Gary Paulsen had thought to include Brian having a Bigfoot encounter into his books. Now that would have been exciting. But one can dream. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, for subscribing, sharing, liking, everything and anything you guys do that helps support the channel and keeps us going. As always, a huge shout out to both our Patreon members and our YouTube channel members for your incredible support. May God be with each and every one of you, no matter what you are dealing with. And I will see you in the next episode.